The empty cradle cast long shadows across the weathered floorboards of Grace Miller's cabin, a cruel reminder of all she had lost. The year was 1876, and the frontier town of Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory, had taken everything from her but the hollow shell of a life she now inhabited. Her fingertips traced the smooth wood of the small bed her husband had crafted before the fever took him, leaving her a widow at 23 with dreams of motherhood slipping through her fingers like prairie dust. The melody came unbidden to Grace's lips as twilight settled over the land. A lullaby her own mother had sung, passed down through generations, now offered to no one but the empty space where a child should be. Her voice, clear and haunting, floated through the open window into the gathering dusk, carrying with it all the ache of her broken heart. Finn Blackwood hadn't meant to eavesdrop. He'd been riding since dawn, searching for strays from the Rockingham ranch where he'd found work after drifting westward for more years than he cared to count. At 31, the lines around his eyes spoke of hard living and harder losses, and the set of his shoulders carried the weight of a past he never discussed. The plaintive singing had drawn him toward the small cabin nestled against the foothills like a moth to flame. He dismounted silently, his boots barely making a sound on the soft earth as he approached the window, drawn by a voice that seemed to reach inside his chest and squeeze. Through the threadbare curtains, he could see her, a slender woman with honey-brown hair falling loose down her back, rocking slowly beside an empty cradle, her hands moving in gentle, maternal motions over nothing but air. The sight struck Finn with such unexpected force that he stumbled back, the jingle of his spurs betraying his presence. The singing stopped abruptly. "Who's there?" Her voice was sharp with fear now, all tenderness vanished. Finn stepped into view, hat in hand. "Beg your pardon, madam. Didn't mean to frighten you." He kept his distance from the window, not wanting to appear threatening. "I was just passing by, looking for strays from the Rockingham." Grace appeared in the doorway, a rifle held steady in her hands. Her eyes, the color of summer sage, were red-rimmed but fierce. "This isn't Rockingham land." "No, madam, it's not." Finn stayed perfectly still, respecting the rifle and the woman holding it with equal measure. "But cattle don't much care about property lines." A flicker of something perhaps reluctant amusement crossed her face, but the rifle didn't waver. "What's your name, Cowboy?" "Finn Blackwood." "Well, Mr. Blackwood, you're trespassing." He nodded slowly. "Yes, madam. And I apologize for that. But if I may say so, you have a beautiful voice." The compliment seemed to catch her off guard. The rifle lowered just slightly. "You were listening to me sing?" "Couldn't help it." His voice was gentle, almost reverent. It was like something from another world. Grace studied him for a long moment. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the deep blue of twilight. His face was weathered but kind, with none of the hardness she'd come to expect from the drifters who occasionally passed through Willow Creek. "It's getting dark," she said finally, lowering the rifle completely. "You'd best be on your way." Finn replaced his hat, tipping it slightly. "Yes, madam." He turned to go, then paused. "That cradle." Her body stiffened. "What about it?" Something in his face softened, revealing a glimpse of understanding that made Grace's throat tighten. "Someday," he said quietly, "it won't be empty." The words hung in the air between them, a promise so audacious from a stranger that Grace almost raised the rifle again. Instead, she found herself speechless as the cowboy mounted his horse and rode away, becoming a silhouette against the darkening sky. Grace closed the door with trembling hands, setting the rifle aside. She returned to the cradle, touching the hand-carved birds that decorated its headboard, her husband's last gift to their unborn child before the same illness that took him had caused her to lose the baby as well. 6 months had passed since that terrible winter, and still, the emptiness consumed her. "Foolish man," she whispered, but the cowboy's words echoed in her mind as she prepared for bed. "Someday, it won't be empty." The audacity of hope when hope had been stripped from her. Yet sleep came easier that night than it had in months. The following day brought no sign of the stranger, and Grace busied herself with her small vegetable garden and the 3 chickens that provided her with eggs. The modest plot of land had been her husband's dream, a place to raise a family away from the crowded East. Now it was simply her sanctuary, a place to heal if healing was even possible. She was hanging laundry when the sound of hoofbeats approached. Shielding her eyes against the midday sun, she saw 2 riders coming toward the cabin. One was the cowboy from the previous evening. The other was Sheriff Daniels from town. Grace set down her laundry basket, suddenly conscious of her simple work dress and loose hair. "Sheriff," she called as they approached. "Is something wrong?" Sheriff Daniels, a portly man with a perpetually worried expression, dismounted with a grunt. "Nothing wrong, Mrs. Miller. Just escorting Mr. Blackwood here. He was mighty insistent on returning to your property, and I wanted to make sure everything was proper." Finn Blackwood remained on his horse, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Miller," he said with a nod, "Mr. Blackwood found something he thought might belong to your late husband." The sheriff continued. "Asked me to accompany him so as not to cause any impropriety." Grace's attention shifted fully to Finn, who now dismounted and approached with deliberate slowness, reaching into his saddlebag. "Found this near Cottonwood Creek," he said, pulling out a leather-bound journal. "Has the name Thomas Miller inside the cover." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Thomas's journal. He always carried it with him. She reached for it with trembling fingers. "Where did you find it?" "About 3 miles east, wedged between some rocks near the water. Must have been carried downstream during the spring melt." Finn handed it to her carefully, as if passing over something sacred. "I noticed the name when I opened it to see if I could find the owner. I asked in town, and the sheriff told me about your husband." Grace clutched the journal to her chest, overwhelmed by this unexpected connection to Thomas. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than you know." Sheriff Daniels cleared his throat. "Well, I'll be heading back to town now that the delivery's been made." He gave Finn a pointed look. "You coming, Blackwood?" Finn hesitated, his eyes on Grace. "Actually, Sheriff, I noticed Mrs. Miller's fence has a section down on the north side. If she's agreeable, I'd like to offer to repair it before I head back to the ranch." The sheriff's bushy eyebrows rose, but before he could speak, Grace surprised herself by saying, "That would be very kind, Mr. Blackwood. I've been meaning to fix it, but haven't had the time." "Well then," the sheriff said, clearly unsure about leaving them alone but finding no legitimate reason to object. "I'll be on my way. Mrs. Miller, you take care now." After the sheriff departed, an awkward silence fell between Grace and Finn. She was suddenly aware of how isolated the cabin was, and how long it had been since she'd been alone with a man who wasn't her husband. "I can show you the fence," she said finally, tucking the journal into her apron pocket. Finn nodded, leading his horse as he followed her around the small cabin to where a section of split-rail fence had indeed collapsed, likely during the winter storms. "I've got some tools in my saddlebag," he said. "Won't take more than an hour or so to set it right." Grace watched as he removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. Finn paused, squinting at her in the bright sunlight. "Doing what?" "This." She gestured to the fence to him. "Bringing Thomas's journal. Offering to help a woman you don't know." Something like sadness flickered across his face. "Maybe because I know what it's like to lose everything. To have an empty space where something precious used to be." The simple honesty of his words struck Grace speechless. She nodded once, then turned toward the cabin. "I'll make some coffee," she said over her shoulder, needing a moment to compose herself. Inside, her hands shook as she stoked the fire in the stove. Through the window, she could see Finn already at work, efficiently gathering the fallen rails and assessing what could be salvaged. There was something in his movements that spoke of quiet competence, of a man accustomed to fixing broken things. When she brought out the coffee, he accepted it with a grateful nod, taking a long drink despite the heat. "Good coffee," he said. Been a while since I had any this strong. Thomas liked it strong enough to stand a spoon in, she said, the memory bringing a small smile to her lips. I never got out of the habit of making it that way. Finn set the cup down on a fence post and returned to his work. How long were you married? 3 years. Grace leaned against the stable door, watching him work. We came out from Ohio. Thomas had big dreams for this place. Finn nodded, hammering a support post into place with practice blows. It's good land. It was supposed to be a family home, she said, the words coming more easily than she expected. Now it's just empty. Finn paused, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. A home's never truly empty as long as there's someone in it with memories and dreams. Grace studied him, this strange cowboy with his unexpected wisdom. You sound like you've given this some thought. Had plenty of time to think, riding the range. He resumed working, his movements methodical. Spent most of my life moving from place to place. Makes a man ponder what makes a place a home. And what's your conclusion? He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. It's not the walls or the roof. It's the heart that beats inside it. Grace felt something shift within her, like ice beginning to crack under the first warmth of spring. This man saw too much, understood too much. It was unnerving and comforting all at once. I should let you work, she said, retreating toward the cabin. Thank you again for the journal. Mrs. Miller, he called after her. When she turned, he added, I meant what I said last night. Grace didn't need to ask what he was referring to. The empty cradle. The promise. She gave him a small nod, unable to form words around the sudden lump in her throat, and continued into the cabin. The fence took longer than an hour, but by mid-afternoon, it stood sturdy and complete. Grace had prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of her preserved venison as thanks. They ate at her small table, the conversation surprisingly easy between them. How long have you been with the Rocking M? She asked. About 3 months, Finn replied. Before that, I was working cattle drives up from Texas. And before that, he shrugged. A little bit of everything. Mining in Colorado. Trapping up north. Whatever work I could find. No place to call home? Something shadowed his eyes. Had one once. Lost it. Grace didn't press. She understood the boundaries of grief, the silent spaces that shouldn't be invaded. The Rocking M is a good outfit, from what I hear. Decent enough. Mr. Morrison's fare pays on time. Finn broke off another piece of cornbread. This is mighty good, Mrs. Miller. Grace, she said suddenly. You can call me Grace. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Grace, he repeated, as if testing the feel of it on his tongue. It suits you. The compliment brought unexpected warmth to her cheeks. She busied herself with clearing the plates, uncomfortable with the unfamiliar feeling. I should be getting back, Finn said, rising from the table. They'll be wondering where I've gotten to. Grace walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him go. Thank you for fixing the fence. And for Thomas's journal. Finn placed his hat on his head, adjusting it with practiced ease. It was my pleasure, Grace. He hesitated, then added, I'd like to check on that fence in a week or so. Make sure it's holding up. She knew it was an excuse, just as she knew she should politely decline. Instead, she heard herself say, That would be fine, Mr. Blackwood. Finn, he corrected with a smile that transformed his solemn face, revealing a dimple in his right cheek. If I'm calling you Grace, seems only fair. Finn, she agreed, returning his smile with a small one of her own. Until next week, then. As she watched him ride away, Grace felt something stirring within her that she had thought long dead, a tiny, fragile spark of anticipation for days yet to come. True to his word, Finn returned the following week. This time, he brought with him a small burlap sack filled with apple seedlings. Notice you don't have any fruit trees, he said by way of explanation. Thought you might like to plant some. Good eating, and in a few years, good trading too. Grace accepted the gift with surprise. Where did you get these? Morrison's wife has an orchard. She was thinning out the saplings. Finn shuffled his feet, suddenly looking almost boyish in his uncertainty. If you don't want them, no, I do, Grace interrupted. It's been a while since anyone's thought about what I might need. Together, they spent the afternoon planting the seedlings in a neat row along the southern edge of her property. The work was peaceful, punctuated by comfortable silence and occasional conversation. Grace found herself telling Finn about her childhood in Ohio, about meeting Thomas at a church social, about their journey west. What about you? She asked as they tamped down the earth around the last seedling. Where are you from originally? Finn straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. Missouri. Small farm near the Kansas border. You have family there still? A shadow crossed his face. No. Farm was burned during the war. My parents didn't make it out. Grace's heart constricted. I'm sorry. Finn nodded, his gaze distant. I was 15. Joined up with a Confederate regiment after that, lied about my age. Wasn't much left for me there anyway. The war took so much from so many, Grace said softly. That it did. Finn seemed to shake himself from the memories. But that's all past now. Can't change it, can only move forward. As they walked back toward the cabin, Grace found herself studying his profile, the straight nose, the strong jaw dusted with stubble, the small scar near his temple that disappeared into his hairline. There was a quiet dignity to him, a steadiness that reminded her of Thomas but was somehow entirely his own. Would you stay for supper? She asked impulsively. I made stew. Finn looked momentarily surprised, then pleased. I'd like that. Over the next month, Finn's visits became a regular occurrence. Each time, he brought something with him: seeds for her garden, a repaired bucket, fresh meat from a deer he'd hunted. Each time, he found some small task to complete around her property: mending the chicken coop, reinforcing the stable door, clearing brush from the creek bed. And each time, Grace found herself watching the trail long after he'd departed, counting the days until his return. The townsfolk began to notice. When Grace made her monthly trip into Willow Creek for supplies, she felt the curious gazes following her, heard the whispers that fell silent as she approached. Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Peterson, the general store owner's wife, called as Grace selected a bolt of fabric. We've been seeing that rocking Cowboy around your place quite a bit. Grace kept her expression neutral. Mr. Blackwood has been kind enough to help with some repairs. Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows rose. Is that all? Yes, Grace said firmly, though her cheeks warmed. That's all. Well, Mrs. Peterson sniffed. You should be careful. A widow alone. People talk. Let them, Grace replied, surprising herself with her boldness. I've nothing to hide. But as she drove her wagon home, Grace wondered if that was entirely true. Her feelings for Finn had grown beyond simple gratitude or friendship. In the quiet evenings after his visits, she found herself remembering the timbre of his laugh, the gentleness of his hands, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. It was a bittersweet recognition. Her heart, which she had thought permanently closed after Thomas's death, was cautiously opening again, and it terrified her. The summer heat settled over the land, turning the prairie grasses golden and the creek to a sluggish trickle. On a particularly scorching afternoon in July, Grace was startled by the sound of multiple horses approaching. Looking up from her garden, she saw Finn riding toward her cabin, leading a second horse with a large bundle strapped to its back. Afternoon, Grace, he called, dismounting with fluid grace. The second horse, she now saw, was laden with lumber. What's all this? She asked, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached. Finn grinned, that dimple appearing in his cheek. Thought your porch could use extending. Gets mighty hot this time of year, and a proper porch gives good shade. Grace blinked in surprise. Finn, that's too much. The lumber alone must have cost, its payment. he interrupted. "For all those meals you've fed me. I'm coming out ahead, trust me." She knew it wasn't true. The few simple meals she'd prepared hardly equaled the value of the lumber and his labor, but the determined set of his jaw told her arguing would be futile. "Thank you," she said instead. "It's a wonderful gift." For 3 days, Finn worked on the porch, sleeping in her stable at night despite her offer to let him use the small room that had once been intended as a nursery. "Wouldn't be proper," he'd said simply, and she hadn't pressed the issue. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, as the extended porch began to take its final shape, a rider approached from the direction of town. Grace recognized Henry Wallace, one of Morrison's ranch hands, as he galloped up to where Finn was working. "Blackwood," Wallace called, breathless. "You're needed back at the ranch. Raiders hit the north pasture. Drove off about 20 head. Morrison's gathering men to go after them." Finn's expression hardened. "Casualties?" "Young Peterson took a bullet in the shoulder." "Doc's with him now." Finn nodded grimly, already gathering his tools. "I'll be right there." He turned to Grace, his eyes apologetic. "I have to go." "Of course," she said, though fear clutched at her heart. "Be careful, Finn." He paused, his gaze holding hers for a long moment. Then, in a move that startled them both, he reached out and squeezed her hand. "I will. I'll be back to finish this, I promise." Grace watched them ride away, dust billowing behind them as they galloped toward the rocking M. She stood on the half-finished porch for a long time, her hands still warm from his touch, her heart racing with unnamed emotions. 3 days passed with no word. Grace tried to keep busy, tending her garden and animals, but her thoughts constantly returned to Finn. On the 4th day, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, she hitched her wagon and drove to town. The atmosphere in Willow Creek was tense. A group of men gathered outside the saloon spoke in hushed, angry tones. Grace approached Sheriff Daniels, who stood watching the group with a wary eye. "Sheriff," she said, "I was wondering if there's any news about the men who went after the cattle raiders." The sheriff's expression was grave. "They caught up with them yesterday near the territorial border. There was a fight." Grace's heart seemed to stop. "Was anyone hurt?" "Morrison's son took a bad hit. They're bringing him back now." He hesitated. "There were other injuries. I don't have all the details yet." "What about Finn Blackwood?" The question came out more desperate than she'd intended. The sheriff's brow furrowed. "Don't rightly know, Mrs. Miller. They should be back by sundown. You're welcome to wait." Grace nodded, too distracted to notice the speculative look the sheriff gave her. She spent the day in an agony of uncertainty, alternating between the general store, where Mrs. Peterson watched her with undisguised curiosity, and the steps of the doctor's office, where she pretended to mend a tear in her shawl. As the sun began its descent, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the returning party. Grace stood, her heart pounding as she counted the approaching riders. 6 men had gone out. 5 were returning. Her eyes searched frantically for Finn's familiar figure as the men rode slowly into town. She spotted him at the rear of the group, supporting another rider who slumped against him. Relief washed over her, followed immediately by concern as she noticed the blood-stained bandage wrapped around Finn's upper arm. The town doctor rushed forward as they dismounted. "Get young Morrison inside quickly," he ordered, pointing to the unconscious man Finn and another ranch hand were supporting. Grace moved toward Finn without conscious thought. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for his injured arm. Finn looked up, surprise and something warmer flickering in his eyes when he saw her. "Grace, what are you doing in town?" "I was worried," she admitted, no longer caring who might hear. "When you didn't come back." A small, tired smile touched his lips. "Just a graze. It looks worse than it is. Let me see it." Her tone brooked no argument. After the injured Morrison was taken inside, she led Finn to a bench outside the doctor's office and gently unwrapped the crude bandage. The wound was indeed a graze, angry and red but not deep. Still, it needed proper cleaning. Wait here, she instructed, then hurried to the general store for supplies. When she returned, Finn was leaning back against the wall, his eyes closed, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. He stirred as she sat beside him. You don't have to do this, he murmured as she began cleaning the wound with water and whiskey. I want to, she replied simply. As she worked, Finn told her what had happened, how they tracked the raiders to a canyon near the territorial border, how the ensuing gunfight had wounded young Morrison and killed one of the raiders, how the others had escaped but without the stolen cattle. Morrison's boy will live, he concluded as she tied off a fresh bandage. But it was close. Grace's hand stilled on his arm. And you? How close was it for you? Finn's eyes met hers, the intensity in them making her breath catch. Not as close as it might have been. I had a reason to be careful. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Grace looked away first, gathering the bloodied cloths and empty whiskey bottle. You should rest, she said. You can stay at my place tonight. It's closer than riding all the way back to the ranch. Finn studied her face for a long moment. Are you sure? Grace nodded. The stable's clean and comfortable. I insist. If he was disappointed by the mention of the stable rather than the house, he didn't show it. Thank you, Grace. They rode back to her cabin as twilight deepened into night, the silence between them comfortable despite the unspoken emotions that swirled around them like dust motes in sunlight. At the cabin, Grace insisted on checking his wound one final time before he retired to the stable. As she gently applied a salve to the angry red line, her fingers trembling slightly against his warm skin, Finn captured her hand in his. Grace, he said softly, I need to tell you something. She looked up, caught by the serious expression in his blue eyes. Morrison's offered me a permanent position at the ranch. Foreman. His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. It would mean staying in one place. Building something lasting. Grace's heart quickened. That sounds like a good opportunity. It is. Finn hesitated, then continued, his voice low and earnest. But before I accept, I need to know something. What's that? She whispered, though some part of her already knew. If I stay. If I build a life here. His eyes never left hers. Would there be any chance for us, Grace? Any chance at all? The question laid bare all that had been growing between them over the past months, tentative, fragile, but undeniably real. Grace felt tears well in her eyes as the walls she'd built around her heart after Thomas's death crumbled completely. Yes, she whispered, the single word carrying all the hope and fear and longing she'd kept locked away. There would be a chance, Finn. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it brought fresh tears to her eyes. I'll take those odds, he murmured as he drew back, his eyes shining with a joy that mirrored her own. That night, Grace slept more peacefully than she had in over a year, the promise of a new beginning settling over her like a comfortable blanket. In the quiet darkness of her room, she glanced at the empty cradle that still stood in the corner and, for the first time since her losses, felt not just pain but possibility. Finn accepted Morrison's offer. Over the next months, as summer turned to autumn and then to winter, he split his time between his duties at the ranch and helping Grace prepare her land for the coming year. The townsfolk watched their courtship with varying degrees of approval and speculation, but Grace found she cared less and less about their opinions. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, Finn knelt before her with a small wooden box in his hand. I know it's soon, he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. And I know Thomas will always have a place in your heart. But I love you, Grace. I think I've loved you since that first night when I heard you singing to an empty cradle. He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band. Will you marry me? Grace touched his face, tracing the lines that spoke of a hard life lived with dignity and courage. Yes, she said, her voice steady and sure. "I love you too, Finn. And yes, I'll marry you." They were married on New Year's Day, 1877, in the small church in Willow Creek. The ceremony was simple, attended by a handful of townsfolk and Finn's fellow ranch hands. Sheriff Daniels gave the bride away, and Mrs. Peterson, who had finally decided the match was acceptable, provided a cake. As they drove back to the cabin that would now be their home, snow began falling again, transforming the landscape into a pristine white expanse that seemed to symbolize their fresh start. "Mrs. Blackwood," Finn said, testing the name as he helped her down from the wagon, "has a nice ring to it." Grace laughed, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring. "It does indeed, Mr. Blackwood." He scooped her up in his arms, ignoring her surprised squeal, and carried her across the threshold. Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming, transformed by the small touches they'd added together over the past month's new curtains at the windows, a braided rug before the hearth, Finn's books alongside hers on the shelves. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Finn's arms around her and his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek, Grace felt complete in a way she hadn't thought possible after her losses. "I was thinking," Finn murmured into her hair, "about the cradle." Grace tensed slightly. They hadn't discussed children, though she knew Finn had noticed how she still sometimes stood by the empty cradle, her hand resting on its edge. "What about it?" she asked carefully. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "I was thinking it might need some companions. A bigger bed for when the little one grows. Maybe a rocking horse." Hope unfurled in Grace's chest. "You want children? With you?" Finn lifted their joined hands to his lips, kissing her fingers. "More than anything." Grace rolled to face him, her eyes shining in the moonlight that filtered through the window. "I was afraid to hope for that again." "I know." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "But remember what I promised you that first night? Someday, it won't be empty. You kept your promise about staying," she whispered. "About building something lasting. And I'll keep this one too." His kiss was a seal on the vow, a promise of all the years to come. Spring arrived in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. The apple seedlings Finn had planted were leafing out, and the garden they'd expanded together was ready for planting. Grace stood on the porch, now fully extended and furnished with chairs Finn had crafted during the winter evenings, and watched as he worked with the 2 horses they'd purchased, the beginnings of the small horse breeding operation they'd decided to start. Her hand drifted to her abdomen, still flat but harboring the secret she'd confirmed with the doctor just yesterday. She hadn't told Finn yet, wanting to choose the perfect moment for news that would change their lives forever. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular shades of orange and pink, Grace took Finn's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "Finn," she said softly, watching his face. "Remember your promise?" Confusion flickered in his eyes, quickly replaced by dawning understanding. "Grace? Are you saying?" She nodded, tears of happiness spilling down her cheeks. "The cradle won't be empty much longer." The joy that transformed his face was something Grace knew she would remember until her dying day. Finn gathered her into his arms, his own eyes wet as he pressed kisses to her face, her hair, her lips. "When?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "November, the doctor thinks." Grace laughed as Finn placed a reverent hand on her stomach again. "We have time to prepare." That night, after Grace had gone to bed, Finn slipped out to his workshop in the stable. By lamplight, he began work on a project he'd been planning for months but hadn't yet started: a second cradle, identical to the first but with one difference. On the headboard, where Thomas had carved birds in flight, Finn would carve a family of horses: a stallion, a mare, and a foal. The months passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Grace's body changed, growing round with the new life within her. Finn worked tirelessly, expanding their small herd of horses, finishing the nursery, building furniture for their growing family. The second cradle stood beside the first, a symbol of how the past and future could exist together in harmony. On a crisp November evening, As the first snow of the season began to fall, Grace went into labor. Finn rode for the doctor and the midwife, his face a mask of controlled panic that made Grace laugh despite her pain. "This baby isn't coming in the next hour," she assured him. "We have time." The labor was long and difficult. Through the night and into the following day, Grace fought to bring their child into the world. Finn never left her side, his steady presence giving her strength when her own began to fail. As twilight approached on the second day, with Grace exhausted and the doctor growing concerned, Finn leaned close to her ear. "Remember that first night?" he whispered. "When I heard you singing? Sing for our baby now, Grace. Let them hear your voice and know it's safe to come." Through cracked lips and with the last of her strength, Grace began to sing the lullaby, the same one Finn had heard her sing to the empty cradle all those months ago. The sweet, simple melody filled the small room, and as the final notes faded, their daughter slipped into the world with a lusty cry that spoke of determination and life. "A girl," the doctor announced, placing the red-faced, squalling infant on Grace's chest. "A healthy baby girl." Grace looked down at the tiny face, overwhelmed by love so fierce it took her breath away. "Faith," she whispered. "Her name is Faith." Finn's fingers trembled as he touched his daughter's dark hair, already a wild tangle like his own. "Faith Blackwood," he repeated, his voice breaking. "It's perfect." That night, after the doctor and midwife had gone and Grace was resting comfortably, Finn sat in the rocking chair by the fire, his newborn daughter cradled in his arms. The empty cradle that had started their journey was no longer empty, its companion waited for the children they might yet have, but this first cradle now held their precious Faith, swaddled in a blanket Grace had lovingly made during the long months of waiting. As moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating the peaceful scene, Finn began to hum the lullaby he'd heard Grace sing that first night, the melody that had drawn him to her window and changed both their lives forever. Grace watched from the bed, her heart so full it seemed impossible it could contain such happiness. "You kept your promise," she murmured sleepily. Finn looked up, his eyes shining with love for the two most important people in his world. "Which one?" "All of them," Grace replied, her smile radiant despite her exhaustion. "You stayed. You built something lasting." "And the cradle?" She glanced at their daughter, sleeping peacefully in the once empty bed. "The cradle isn't empty anymore." Finn rose carefully, mindful of the precious bundle in his arms, and moved to sit beside her on the bed. "And I'll keep making promises, Grace. And keeping them. For all the days of our lives." As they sat together in the quiet night, their family complete and whole, the empty spaces in both their hearts finally filled with love and hope and faith, Grace knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning of their story. 5 years passed, bringing changes both great and small to the Blackwood family. Faith grew from a determined infant into a spirited young girl with Finn's dark hair and Grace's sage-green eyes. The horse breeding operation flourished under Finn's careful management, allowing them to expand their holdings and build a larger home adjacent to the original cabin, which they preserved as a reminder of their beginnings. And the cradles, both of them, were filled again. 2 years after Faith's birth, Grace gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Frederick and Felicity. The family of 5 settled into a rhythm of work and play, love and learning, that transformed the once lonely homestead into a place of joy and laughter. On a warm summer evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace stood on the porch watching Finn teach Faith to ride her own pony, a gentle dappled mare bred specifically for their daughter. The twins, now 3, played in the yard under the watchful eye of Mrs. Peterson's daughter, who helped with the children several days a week. Grace's hand rested on her stomach, where a 4th child had just begun to make its presence known. She hadn't told Finn yet, savoring the secret for a few more days. As if sensing her thoughts, Finn looked up from adjusting Faith's stirrups and met Grace's gaze across the yard. The love that passed between them was as tangible as the evening breeze, a connection that had only deepened with the passing years. Later, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Grace and Finn sat together on the porch, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. "I was thinking," Grace said softly, "we might need another cradle." Finn's arm tightened around her. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral though she could hear the underlying excitement. Grace smiled, taking his hand and placing it over her still flat abdomen. "That's so." The joy that lit Finn's face was as bright as it had been with each of their previous children. He gathered her close, pressing his lips to her forehead. "When?" "February, I think." Finn's hand remained on her stomach, protective and reverent. "For children!" he marveled. "If someone had told me 6 years ago that this would be my life, would you have believed them?" Grace asked, looking up at his beloved face, marked now with new lines that spoke of laughter more than hardship. "Not for a second." Finn's smile was tender. "But I would have wanted to." Grace thought back to that first night, to the empty cradle and the despair that had threatened to consume her. To the stranger who had appeared at her window, drawn by a lullaby, and made a promise that had seemed impossible at the time. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" she asked. "About the cradle?" Finn nodded, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "I said someday it wouldn't be empty." He chuckled softly. "Though I didn't expect we'd need 4 of them." Grace laughed, the sound floating out into the night. "Well, 3 so far." "You'd better start working on number 4. "Yes, madam," Finn replied with mock seriousness. "First thing tomorrow." As they sat together in the peaceful darkness, the future stretching before them full of promise and possibility, Grace thanked whatever twist of fate had brought this man to her window on that lonely night so long ago. From emptiness had come fullness, from despair, hope, from loss, the greatest love she could have imagined. And as Finn began to hum the lullaby that had started it all, Grace joined in, their voices blending in the melody that would forever remind them of beginnings, of promises kept, and of cradles that would never be empty again.